Do we take enough risks or do we take too many risks? Many have questioned whether it's worthwhile to take a risk. Some who want to take no risks are called too control-oriented, even euphemistically speaking, or derogatorily control freaks. Others who take arguably too many risks or bad risks are said to be foolhardy or seeking thrills at the cost of taking, again, too many risks. Whether bungee jumping, some say, or hang gliding, or jumping out of airplanes for fun in general, who knows? Even going into high-crime neighborhoods inadequately prepared. And there even being then careers that are high-risk careers, and you can get combat pay, so to speak, as compensation for the additional risks involved. It being risky, of course, to go to war in the conventional sense on a battlefield. But as one man, Dr. David Viscott, a psychiatrist, once pointed out, there can be risks to not taking risks. This whole idea also of risk-taking is covered by Tim Ferriss in videos, and I'm sure many others also. Two particular books of interest I've read over the years, or part of them, is David Viscott's Risking: How to Face the Crucial Choices That Will Help You Make the Most of Your Life, and Ben Carson's book, Take the Risk. Ben Carson having been a magnificent brain surgeon and then having moved on to work with housing urban development. Now, at the outset, I think we all have heard the phrase, no pain, no gain. You might say, alternatively, nothing risked, nothing gained. And others saying that if they take a lot of risk and do a lot of legwork, that they deserve huge benefits in terms of financial or other compensation later down the line. This exactly said by Chris Do, for instance, D.O., who heads up lecturing both in person in Santa Monica, California areas and online. But what even do we call risky? And as per the phrase, you should burn your bridges or you shouldn't burn your bridges, depending on the person talking, what is a burnt bridge and why might that not be so good an idea, some would say? Well, consider the idea of silver linings, too. Unintended positive consequences. Now, there is a Dr. Martha Beck who has taken several big risks in life. She grew up in the Mormon Church and took big risks to leave the Mormon Church. In fact, she had death threats upon her, and she wrote a book on this, in fact. Also at a point in time, this woman, who has 3 sociology degrees, all from Harvard University, now at the PhD level, said that while she was a student at the graduate level, she became pregnant, and a test revealed that the child was likely to have Down syndrome. And 5 physicians urged her, for the sake of both herself and perhaps the baby to come and child, to abort the child. She decided otherwise and took the risk that her ideas were better than the 5 physicians and whoever else talking to her. Likewise, in a different vein completely, Dr. Albert Schweitzer took the risk with his medical degree and 2 PhDs of leaving Europe and going to Africa when many people said he was foolhardy to give up all the money and fame he could have had in Europe, but he took the risk. Others take risks to go to Hollywood or New York City, say, to pursue the silver screen or acting in the theater in New York, or as per artistry, or business. Risk, risk, risk. And in turn, how do we even know to a great degree of certainty what assets we have, what talents we have, and what liabilities we have too, that we either misestimate or have blind spots on? Hence again, too, how can we know the outcome and thus it being risky? Or you might say decisions made under degrees of uncertainty, especially concerning our personal assets and liabilities, and regarding what we think people most want to buy or most enjoy versus what really is the case, from group to group or what have you. And how long it will take to make a match, so to speak, between our offerings and what people will like or buy. But I like again the idea here put out by Martha Beck, who said after having her Down child delivered, and after a span of time, that it was the best thing she ever could have done because of, in part, what she so learned from this individual. Likewise, some might say it is not a good idea to marry a handicapped person. I, for instance, was once engaged to a woman who was legally blind, and yet this individual, and arguably so many others with, quote, handicaps, have had to muster so much courage to survive and keep on, that they are magnificent individuals emotionally, if not always physically. Hence, too, then, the individual in Ghana, Africa, who inspired the nation by persisting despite a genetic handicap to his leg or more, and then the ensuing movie, too, about his life and inspiring facets, Emmanuel's Gift. The point being, how can we know what an outcome will be? Some say it would be so terrible, whether to ourselves or as per whom we marry, and yet maybe the outcome far better than what we could have had otherwise. For one of my physicians is a cancer specialist and integrative medicine practitioner in general, and he was on television once with Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup author, and they said that they have seen, or my physician has seen, that to get cancer can be a wake-up call, and the best thing, many say, that ever happened to them then. They're never having, in my estimation then, the thorns in the side necessary for profound growth, for profound questioning until this point. This silver lining, in effect, that they would not have opted for. Some might even say a prison sentence can be such a great school of hard knocks or a wake-up call. Chuck Colson, for instance, of Watergate fame, found that to be so. In prison, arguably some of his drugs of choice were removed from him, and he found what you might call religion, spirituality, or a new framework, started a ministry, and arguably would have said that the unintended prison sentence was the best thing that ever happened to him. Now, on the other hand, though, the marketing expert Seth Godin has said that if you take too many risks, you will take yourself out of the equation entirely, i.e., via death probably, that you won't be able to take any more risks, and so you have to watch it there. But to a less extent, the dating coach and otherwise, Alpha 2.0 group leader Caleb Jones, who in some estimate has gone a little too far in this sexual department. His mother, by the way, once having been a nun, and his having been put in Catholic school, rebelled and went perhaps the opposite direction, has said that in his estimation, the only big risk you can take that you're going to regret is to have a child that you don't want, and for, in other words, a woman you have intimate relations with getting pregnant and she not have an abortion, and his deeming this perhaps such a ball and chain for the next 18 years or more that this, in his estimation, is intolerable, or what you might call an intolerable risk. And yet again, what he doesn't say, though, is what are the silver lining effects of having a child, even if you didn't intend to have one. Ironically, then, many a woman, I believe, may find having a child they had not planned to be an unacceptable package deal or risk, and be quite consternated and too over-concerned. Whereas some might consider a unintended pregnancy, even from a rape, to be a silver lining in that maybe something better could happen in terms of their overall life for themselves or the child than had been planned otherwise. Thus, again, the concept extended to Martha Beck of how she said having a Down syndrome child she hadn't planned for, wouldn't have opted for, wouldn't have signed up for, being the best thing that ever happened to her. Then the same said by some for cancer. Even, say, being on a deathbed, a wake-up call for some that is not desired or chosen by some people, including Steve Jobs, who had a real change of heart in certain directions on his deathbed only. And there being videos to this effect of how he claims he had it all wrong in certain departments, but the deathbed was the wake-up call. There are also being examples of how if someone had not carried out having a child after a rape, a famous musician, say, or famous writer, or whatnot, would not have been born, and that the parent had almost gone ahead and had an abortion. This might have even applied to Beethoven as a potentially unwanted child in this direction. But the details are lacking for me. There is one last risk I would like to point out that some people are very afraid of taking, and that is the risk of making oneself vulnerable to others. In other words, to take the mask off, to let one's guard down, to say things that we can be afraid could be used against us, whether in a court of law or as per our, shall we say, overall reputation in a community, even if it doesn't affect us financially or our life. Some might say, I can't open up and say this or that about myself or say anything to include advocating for someone else's rights or welfare, because it might come back upon me in a fashion too risky, too costly. And yet who's to say then whether the costly effects could in many cases be a silver lining? Garrison Keillor, for instance, of Prairie Home Companion, a storyteller, writer, showman, has said that he has seen people opt not to go to military service, shall we say, or military operations despite a draft notice, go to prison and pay a heavy price. But perhaps the heavy price had a silver lining in terms of growth that would otherwise not have come from these thorns in the side in prison, and beneficial then not only to this person but the nation, or world. A perfect case in point being Nelson Mandela. He took a stand on various issues, paid a heavy price, 27 years in prison, and yet found it so growth-promoting, and to an extent that the nation thought so too in South Africa, and made him president for one term, upon which he left after one term. But this, an unattended, in some respects, silver lining benefit of 27 years prison time, noting that he had not opted for prison time because he had played a cat and mouse game trying to avoid prison. I believe I read or heard even wearing disguises. And yet, arguably, without prison time there would have been no major reform in South Africa as per his being president later on. Now, I at this point personally believe one reason why we all often fear speaking up or revealing things about ourselves and regard them then as burnt bridges too risky to take is because often I believe we misestimate our vocabulary. I believe our vocabulary tends greatly or almost entirely to be disrespectful when it comes to people, unless we have exquisitely refined it and kicked certain words out of our vocabulary even as to what to use. Some would even say a slant on vocabulary being swearing. But in general, I would say vocabulary can be very difficult to take back for certain reasons, and thus we call it sticking our foot in our mouth, or being insulting, or having lack of tact, or not the right word at the right time. Or did I say already, disrespectful? And many of us don't discover till after the fact when we've said something and want to take back, so to speak, that we said a word that was often very commonplace in the dictionary and yet regret later that we said it. But should we have had regrets, and should we regret speaking up too much and sticking our foot in our mouth, there are silver lining effects to the positive, even to being disrespectful or call it insulting. For arguably, it was Nelson Mandela, not just his taking a stand, but being insulting in how he did so, some would say, that landed him in prison. And the same for assassinations, that many people are assassinated, in my opinion, not just for what they say or do, but how they do it in an insulting manner. And yet, shy of death, might an imprisonment be a silver lining effect both to them and the country, especially as one grows in prison to refine their vocabulary set, whether it's Nelson Mandela or arguably even Gandhi, who I'm sure had to refine his vocabulary, lawyer or not as he was, as time went on. And I'd say in my life also, not a lawyer. For I've said things in my past that theoretically I regretted, but as time went on I refined my vocabulary greatly by necessity and almost, you might say, by counter-reaction. And to plus effects perhaps, not just now, but for the future, myself and others included. Without the disrespectful terminology and the risks I took and some others took saying the words, whether uttered just in and of themselves or in taking a stand, shall we say, there would not have been the silver lining effects. And who can predict what they will be? Now, arguably, a problem with words and how hard they can hurt others is, as per the phrase, talking, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But in my opinion, words can hurt even more than sticks and stones, in that often what is said is believed, because the very nature of words being that if they're in the dictionary, we tend to assume that the definitions are accurate. In other words, if someone says that something exists because the word for it exists, we tend to believe it. And with regard to what we hear as an insult, if the term exists, then surely many of us reason what is said about us, because the term exists, must also be there. Hence, even in religious circles, many people believing in hellfire damnation just because the word hell exists, and for no other reason at all. So in other words then, to deprogram certain fears or certain feelings of low self-esteem, we may really have to deneuter or kick certain words out of our vocabulary set as fallacious or without substance. And this is very difficult for many or most people to do. Noting that Chris Doe, again, in California, has said he loves deneutering certain words, or I would say kicking them out of your dictionary, or taking the sting out of them, finding the flaws in them, and why they were even created, sometimes for somebody's particular machinations or marketing benefits, and otherwise the word's fallacious. For many think that if a word exists, what it says about reality must be true, when in fact a word can be created that is a misrepresentation, and each word needs to be considered in and of itself, especially in the people area, I believe, to see if it is conveying a true concept or not, or only a truth and a mistruth at the same time. And this then, in my opinion, why words can hurt more than sticks and stones, because we can figure why a stick and stone, so to speak, might hurt us, but we can often not eliminate the pain of words unless we eliminate the word itself that we had heard applied to us. And this is much harder to do, I believe. It takes far more intellectual effort and skill. And in turn then, why nations sometimes fight over wounded self-esteem, in turn from the insults of words that cannot easily be defused. Hence, again, the contradiction in the phrase, sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words indeed, and the insults behind them, causing wars that can last generations, in fact. So this then, I believe, short of death itself from something absolutely inane, like jumping out of an airplane with no parachute and hoping to be able to fly, that being the excess by far in risk-taking, I think the biggest risk we most face internally, in the back of our minds at least, call it taking a risk too big, or a queasy risk, or calling it burning your bridges and being queasy about that too. The risk being to take the risk of saying something with our vocabulary and not knowing whether our vocabulary is up to snuff in the respect department, and what may follow as a result. The result being deemed an insult, or some say narcissistic wound that many cannot deprogram the effects of in their lives, and then leaving a lingering negative after effect. Maybe, though, the silver lining of someone being permanently insulted by our words is how we have to grow in learning that you can't please everyone all the time. Hence, the idea, too, of toughening up, or learning to accept that no matter how hard you try and explain yourself, some people will not understand, or no matter how hard you try to explain how you've changed, some people will not believe it. They're even thinking perhaps if you've become a kind and serene person that you must be smoking dope on the side, or what have you, or be a fraud. So we have to come to believe in ourselves, I believe, far more than what other people believe about us in terms of, say, the concept of knowing your worth or knowing your strengths and weaknesses. And just possibly, then, even the extent to which we say something that is permanently affecting someone else's self-esteem negatively and termed a narcissistic wound or insult of a permanent nature that the other person can't defuse and get over, can be the silver effect in us to cause us to grow, to be more firm in ourselves of who we are, our pluses and minuses, and our own yardsticks for happiness, what gives us the most pleasure. And in turn, this not coming until we have to define these rigorously for ourselves, especially when faced against those who do not like us or hate us or more. And in turn, sometimes because they have experienced insults that they cannot deprogram, because the words they also have a difficult time deprogramming or deneutering or what have you. The silver lining to this, again, of a permanent insult someone else feels at any rate, being how we learn to handle it when hopefully we have changed, but the other person hasn't. We have to become firmer thus, or say toughen up, as to who we are and what we have to offer others in general then, rather than letting it be defined for us by other people and then being like a leaf tossed in the wind. Thoughts here concerning risk-taking.